For centuries, the very word Sparta evoked terror mixed with painful respect among the Greeks. It was pronounced with a special intonation, as one would speak of a storm at sea or a plague, without affection, but acknowledging its power. The polis was an idea embodied in bronze and blood, in the ranks of the phalanx, and in the scars on the bodies of warriors. The Spartan mirage, cultivated by the Lacedaemonians, claimed that their phalanx was impenetrable, their spirit unbreakable, and their right to hegemony granted by the gods and reinforced by centuries of victories. This mirage penetrated the minds of even those who were not their allies. Merchants, travelers, and mercenaries retold stories of Spartan training, and every retold word reinforced the legend. From childhood, having gone through the agoge, a training system similar to the training of fighting dogs, the Spartans knew no fear or pity. They were broken down and then rebuilt without any softness. Their red cloaks, whose color concealed blood, became a symbol of death. Warriors from other city-states, seeing this color, felt a wave of anxiety rise within them, even if their minds tried to resist. It was considered madness to challenge Sparta in open field, in fair hoplite combat. It was like a game whose outcome was known in advance. The Athenians could outmatch them at sea or behind walls, using cunning and allied fleets, but not on the plain. The axiom was simple and ruthless. If the Spartan army deployed for battle, the enemy had already lost psychologically. The city-states preferred to pay tribute and send their sons to die under the command of the Spartan kings, just so they would not see their spears aimed at their homes or hear the sound of footsteps approaching their fields. Sparta became a machine of oppression, operating almost automatically. It did not create culture, did not build temples like my Parthenon, where every column is a hymn to reason and harmony. Instead, it preserved an order where the strong devour the weak, like beasts in the forest. Where other cities adorned their squares with statues, built theaters, and debated laws and tragedies in the agora, Sparta maintained a harsh simplicity, elevating asceticism and military discipline to the rank of supreme virtues. Fear paralyzed Greece, turning it into a hostage of a single polis. Cities consulted Sparta before taking any action, as if asking an invisible overseer for permission for every breath they took. This stone order seemed eternal, like a law carved in rock that could neither be erased nor rewritten. No one saw the cracks because everyone was too accustomed to the familiar form of fear. No one except one man, who looked at war through the eyes of a scientist, accustomed to looking for asymmetry and weakness, seeing in the structure not only strength, but also tension that could one day lead to a rupture. Friends, they say that one like under this video replaces an hour of meditation, and subscribing to the channel inevitably leads to a better life. So hurry up and click the buttons, and we'll continue. Epaminondas was not a hero of the Aedae. His name was not accompanied by a list of miraculous deeds of youth, and no songs were composed about him in the spirit of ancient epics. He was not a king by birth, like the Spartan rulers who traced their lineage back to Heracles, and could not hide behind his sacred origins to demand obedience. He did not have the wealth to hire mercenaries, nor the luxury of buying victories with gold. He was an aristocrat from an ancient family, but his family had fallen into poverty, and his youth was spent in abstinence and learning. Where other young people spent their time feasting and competing for empty glory, he sat over scrolls, listened to the conversations of wise men, and trained not only his body, but also his ability to ask questions. Born in Thebes, a city that the Athenians particularly despised, calling its inhabitants Boeotian pigs, he became a living refutation of stereotypes, an intellectual in armor, a philosopher with a spear. His very existence was a challenge to the usual jokes and ridicule directed at Boeotia. His teacher was the Pythagorean Lysis of Tarentum, who fled to Thebes after the defeat of the communities in Italy. For the young man, meeting such a person was like discovering a new universe. Instead of simple stories about gods and heroes, he gained access to the world of numbers, proportions, and proofs. Lysis instilled in him a love of philosophy, mathematics, and logic, showing him that numbers describe the movement of troops, the balance of power, the rhythm of melody, and the structure of just laws. While most warriors saw the battlefield as a line with the enemy in front and their own troops behind, Epaminondas began to perceive it as a diagram, where masses could be moved to create advantages where the enemy did not expect them. The Pythagorean habit of seeking harmony in apparent chaos would later manifest itself in his constructions and decisions. While the Spartans trained their bodies, Epaminondas trained his mind, without forgetting the military craft. He was an orator, a thinker, and a musician who played the lyre, which in Sparta was considered unworthy of a warrior. For the Lacedaemonians, music was merely an accompaniment to the phalanx's march, but for Epaminondas, it was a way of understanding rhythm and the transitions from tension to release, which he then transferred to his tactical schemes. For him, the phalanx was a figure on a board where every step was calculated, not just a pile of shields and spears. He was seen as the ideal of a new warrior, a man who fought out of duty and reason, not under the pressure of blind discipline. He never married, devoting himself to the city as a priest devotes himself to serving the temple. When reproached for not having children, he later replied that he was leaving behind 2 immortal daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea, and in these words, one could sense the confidence of a man for whom true offspring are not bodies, but perfect deeds. At first he was just a citizen who saw Thebes suffocating under the Spartan boot, how ambassadors spoke in a humiliated tone, how soldiers returned under foreign banners. He understood that in order to defeat Sparta, it was necessary to stop playing by its rules, to change the paradigm of war and politics, and to prepare a strike in the minds of his fellow citizens, freeing them from their internal acceptance of their subordinate role. The war that changed Greece did not begin with the clang of swords, but in the silence of the negotiating room, where only the rustle of clothing and the dry scratch of a stylus on a wax tablet could be heard. Epaminondas knew that before drawing his sword, he had to win the battle of wills and rights, because victory without moral justification quickly turns into a new cycle of hatred. In 371 BC, a congress of Greek states gathered in Sparta for universal peace. It was an attempt to restore order in Hellas, weary of endless wars. But each participant saw peace in their own way. Some saw it as a respite, others as a consolidation of their advantages. Sparta, feeling its grip weakening, sought to consolidate its dominance legally, to turn the fear it instilled into the lines of a treaty. The Spartan king, Agesilaus II, old, lame, but with a strong will, negotiated from a position of strength, relying on the memory of past victories. His strategy was a peace treaty signed by each polis separately, so that no one could hide behind allies. The formula of autonomy for each polis effectively fragmented the alliances of Sparta's opponents, cutting them into weak parts, incapable of resistance. The stumbling block was Sparta's demand to dissolve the Boeotian League, a federation of cities led by Thebes. For Thebes, this meant political death. the loss of its central role, and its disintegration into a mass of secondary towns. This demand revealed the essence of Spartan policy: divide and conquer. It was here that Epaminondas struck his first blow, not with a spear, but with words. As a representative of Thebes, he spoke before the kings and ambassadors without hiding behind conventions. When Agesilaus demanded that the Boeotian cities swear allegiance separately from Thebes, citing independence, Epaminondas asked, "Are you prepared, Agesilaus, to grant the same independence to the cities of Laconia?" There was no embellishment in this question, only dry logic. Laconia, the region of Sparta, populated by Perioeci and Helots, had no rights. Sparta owned them as slaves, granting them neither autonomy nor a voice. Epaminondas publicly tore off the mask. "You demand freedom for our allies, but you keep your neighbors in slavery." He forced everyone present to see the mirror image of the Spartan slogan in their own house. Epaminondas proved himself to be a brilliant diplomat. At the peace talks, he demanded freedom for the cities of Laconia, placing the Boeotian League and the Spartan state on an equal footing. He showed that Thebes was merely doing to Boeotia what Sparta had long been doing to Laconia, but one was called a crime, and the other was considered normal. Agesilaus, enraged, crossed Thebes off the list of participants in the peace. This movement of the stylus across the list was a de facto declaration of war. Many considered this to be suicidal, believing that Thebes would not be able to withstand open confrontation with Lacedaemon. But Epaminondas drove Sparta into a moral impasse, portraying it as an aggressor and Thebes as freedom fighters ready to stand their ground to the end. The Spartan king Cleombrotus, who was nearby with his army, received orders to march and punish Thebes, just as Sparta had previously punished the rebellious. Thus the diplomatic struggle smoothly transitioned into a military one. The Battle of Leuctra in the summer of 371 BC was a triumph of intellect over tradition. The field where it took place was no different from dozens of others, but it was there that the old rules were turned against those who relied on them. For centuries, two phalanxes of hoplites had clashed head-on, with the best warrior standing on the right flank. This was considered an almost sacred order, to violate which was to insult the best. The Spartans placed the king and the elite on the right, struck the enemy's weak left flank, and then turned their formation, breaking the enemy. This pattern was repeated over and over again, like a memorized movement. Epaminondas applied a new approach, the oblique order, an echeloned attack, as if turning the board at a different angle. He abandoned the beautiful but dangerous symmetry, preferring asymmetry as a source of advantage. Epaminondas employed a revolutionary strategy by abandoning symmetry. He deliberately weakened his right flank and center, ordering them to retreat slowly, creating an oblique battle formation. The enemy saw an uneven line in front of them, mistaking it for uncertainty, but all the power was concentrated elsewhere. On the left flank, directly opposite the Spartan kings, he concentrated his striking force. Instead of the standard depth of 8 to 12 rows, he formed a colossal column of 50 rows. It was a living battering ram, a vertical wedge capable of breaking through any wall of shields. At the tip of the wedge stood the sacred band, 300 warriors under the command of Pelopidas, Epaminondas's friend. These were not just well-armed fighters. They were bound by personal loyalty to each other and a common oath. and this inner bond made them stronger than any iron chain. For history, it was almost an instant, but for those who stood in formation, every spear thrust, every step, was an eternity. Cleombrotus tried to reorganize the ranks, but it was too late. The sacred band engaged them in battle, and the 50-row column, acting as a battering ram, crushed the Spartan elite. It was a complete defeat. The Spartans lost not only the battle, but also their aura of invincibility. Epaminondas proved that war is a science, not just a habit. To understand the scale of the disaster, one must see Sparta as a fragile organism dependent on a thin layer of citizens. Power belonged only to the Spartans, full citizens whose numbers had been declining for centuries due to wars, earthquakes, and property laws, a lycanthropy, a shortage of people. Each new conflict, each loss, struck not at the masses, but at the very heart of the system. By the time of Leuctra, the number of Spartans capable of bearing arms barely exceeded 1,000, and this was the limit beyond which the internal order was threatened. The Spartan king Cleombrotus I, the first monarch to fall in battle since Leonidas at Thermopylae, was killed in the battle. This parallel with Leonidas was obvious to anyone who remembered the legends of Thermopylae, but now Sparta could no longer present this feat as a heroic sacrifice for future victory. Even more terrible was the death of 400 of the 700 Spartans who took part in the battle. In one day, Sparta lost almost half of its civilian corps and a third of its military elite, and there was nothing to fill these gaps. It was a qualitative blow to the gene pool. It was not just soldiers who died, but the future political class, members of the Gerousia and the Ephorate. The cities of Hellas saw the unthinkable. The Spartans were fleeing, and their king was dead. Leuctra became a demographic death sentence. It was impossible to restore the number of citizens due to the closed nature of the caste, and there was nothing to fill the gaps in the ranks. The news of the defeat reached Sparta during the Gymnopedia festival. On this day, songs usually rang out, glorifying the young men, their strength and training. But now these sounds resonated with the news of the death of the best. The ephors forbade women to cry and ordered the festival to continue as if nothing had happened. The Spartan mask of imperturbability had to be maintained at all costs. But everyone understood. Old Sparta was finished. They could hide their tears, but they could not hide the emptiness in their ranks. Epaminondas had knocked the foundation out from under Spartan statehood. Having wounded the beast, he decided to finish it off in its lair, for an unfinished beast is capable of instilling fear again. The Spartans were proud. Our city has no walls, for its walls are the courage of its citizens. Scattered across the Eurotas Valley, Sparta had been without fortifications for centuries. No one dared to invade Laconia, and this fact became a symbol of its special status. In the winter of 370 BC, breaking with the custom of not fighting in winter, Epaminondas led an army of 70,000 men into the heart of the Peloponnese. For most Greeks, the very idea of a winter campaign seemed reckless. The roads were difficult. Supplies were hard to come by. But that was precisely why the enemy least expected an attack. For the first time in 600 years, the enemy approached their homes. The elders could not remember anything like it, and even the legends did not preserve such stories. The Theban army crossed the Eurotas, ravaging estates and burning fields that had been considered inviolable for centuries. The Spartans, who had previously mocked the misfortune of others, rushed in panic through the streets when they saw the smoke from the fires. It was a psychological breakdown. The Peloponnesian League began to fall apart. Arcadia, Elis, and Argos, no longer bound by fear, turned their weapons against their former masters. Each campaign deepened the cracks, turning them into a chasm. Agesilaus was forced to put even the elderly and children on defense, turning the entire city into an improvised garrison. Epaminondas did not storm the city's buildings. He wanted to destroy not the houses, but the status of a great power, so that even the surviving walls could not restore the former authority. He set fire to the sacred land, and then struck at the very foundation of the Spartan system. The economic base of Lacedaemon was based on fear and slavery. Sparta could not exist without the Helots. Its entire model assumed that some would live without working, while others would work without truly living. Every Spartan was exempt from labor from birth, living by warfare, because dozens of slaves worked for him. All the Syssitia, which conferred civil rights, were paid for by the labor of the conquered. The communal meal was not just a ritual, but a demonstration that a citizen could afford to live at someone else's expense. Epaminondas committed an act more terrible than military defeat. He took away Sparta's property, which had been considered its right of conquest for 300 years. He questioned not only the power of Spartan weapons, but also the naturalness of their way of life. In the winter of 370 to 369 BC, Epaminondas founded a new city, Messene, on the slopes of Mount Etoma. Etoma had long been a symbol of resistance and hope for those whom Sparta kept in submission, so the choice of this location had not only strategic, but also deep emotional significance. Exiles flocked here, descendants of those who had fled the Spartan yoke, people who passed down from generation to generation the memory of their lost land. During his first campaign, he revived the independent state of Messenia by founding Messene on Etoma, which deprived Sparta of a third of its territory and its main source of helots. For those who had been considered living property for centuries, this change was like a resurrection from the dead. The walls of Messenia, erected in record time and becoming a masterpiece of fortification, became the tombstone of Spartan greatness, a kind of stone document on which was written, "From now on, others rule here." Economic collapse. The loss of Messenia meant the loss of the most fertile lands of the Peloponnese. Sparta lost about half of its economic potential. The fields that had previously supplied the Spartan citizens with bread, oil, and wine now worked for those who had been slaves yesterday. Sparta had previously been a parasitic superpower, where every Spartan lived off war while the Helots gave up half their harvest. Now, this system had collapsed. Having lost their land, many Spartans could no longer make the mandatory contributions to the Syssites, the communal meals. According to the laws of Lycurgus, such citizens lost their rights and were relegated to the category of hypomaions, the despised. The proud warriors had to take up the plow themselves, which for them was a humiliation worse than death. Epaminondas triggered social collapse. Without killing a single Spartan, he killed hundreds of citizens by depriving them of their income. The class of equals was shrinking, and with it, the foundation of the political system was melting away. The Spartans had to take up the plow, which was considered a humiliation worse than death, because from childhood they had been taught to despise labor, associating it with slavery. Now, life itself forced them to take the place of those they had previously oppressed. Epaminondas not only freed the slaves, he gave them a state with a government, an army, and alliances. This distinguished him from those who limited themselves to defeating the enemy. He filled the void with a new structure. Yesterday's slaves now stood on the walls of their city, armed against their former masters, and this image, a helot with a spear on the wall of Messene, was harder for Sparta to bear than any defeat on the battlefield. Sparta found itself squeezed. to the north by hostile Arcadia, united by Epaminondas with its center in Megalopolis, to the west by Messenia. Lacedaemon had gone from being the besieger to the besieged, losing its former freedom of maneuver. The myth of divine protection collapsed. Zeus, on Itomi, accepted the sacrifices of the free Messenians, turning away from the shores of the Eurotas. Even those who still clung to the old legends were forced to admit that the old theological justifications no longer worked. Sparta lost its allies, slaves, and aura. Time passed, and fear of Thebes forced enemies to unite. Those who had feared the Spartans yesterday now feared the strengthening of Thebes. Athens sided with Sparta. The Arcadian League split. Cracks ran through all the alliances, as if the earth were shaking from continuous tectonic shifts. By 362 BC, the situation had come to a head. Epaminondas, realizing the threat to his achievements, once again led his army to the Peloponnese. He could not allow his victories to be lost in a series of minor wars and conspiracies. The final battle was at Mantinea, even more difficult than Leuctra, because now the enemies knew what he was capable of and had learned from his own tactics. The plains of Boeotia allowed Epaminondas to develop a cavalry which the Spartans had neglected. Unlike the mountainous regions, here horses could develop speed, and riders could practice complex maneuvers. The Spartan cavalry was weak, with poor horses. It was recruited on a residual basis, without devoting any time or the best people to it. The Theban cavalry, on the other hand, became an elite force, part of a conscious doctrine. Thanks to Boeotia, Epaminondas created a powerful cavalry that defeated the Spartan cavalry at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC and struck the phalanx's flank. He introduced the Hippipoi, lightly armed infantrymen who ran alongside horsemen and struck vulnerable spots from below. These men were the link between the world of infantry and the world of cavalry, compensating for the weaknesses of each branch of the army. This synergy between the branches of the military was unprecedented, because before that, cavalry and infantry often acted side by side, but not together. At Mantinea, Epaminondas again used the oblique order, but complicated it, turning the battlefield into a stage where each character had to play their role at the right moment. Knowing that a strike was expected from the left, he staged a deception. The army, approaching the field, laid down their weapons as if preparing to camp. The dust settled, the shields were lowered, and to observers it might have seemed like the beginning of a rest. The enemy relaxed, allowing themselves to break their perfect formation. At that moment, Epaminondas gave the order. The shock column, like the bow of a trireme, rammed into the right flank of the Spartans, and the force of the blow was amplified by the element of surprise. The Theban horsemen with their hamipae swept away the enemy cavalry, then struck the unprotected infantry in the flank. This was a prototype of the hammer and anvil tactic later made famous by Alexander. The infantry holds the line, creating an anvil, while the cavalry delivers the decisive flanking blow, playing the role of the hammer. The victory was complete. The Spartan phalanx faltered and fled. The world where Sparta was the measure of military valor was finally collapsing, but the price of this triumph for Thebes was terrible. Epaminondas, being in the front ranks, his mistake as a strategist, pursued the enemy, inspiring his troops with his personal bravery. At that moment, fate, indifferent to plans and doctrines, intervened in the course of the battle. Epaminondas died in the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC from a dart, according to other versions, a spear, that pierced his chest. The tip remained inside. His fall caused chaos. The victorious army stopped. The Boeotians did not finish off the enemy, as if their hearts had stopped at the moment when blood should have rushed to their limbs. Brought to the camp, he remained conscious. The doctors said that removing the tip would lead to fatal bleeding. He asked if the shield had been saved and if the Thebans had won. Hearing yes, he said, "Then I die happy," and ordered the spear to be pulled out. Honor and the outcome of the battle were more important to him than his own life. With his death, Thebes' energy died out like a flame that had lost its fuel. Xenophon wrote, "After the battle, there was even more turmoil and disorder in Greece than before. Without Epaminondas' guiding vision, Thebes could no longer control these disturbances. But ideas are immortal. Epaminondas' seeds sprouted in Macedonia, where the soil proved fertile for them. Philip II, the future creator of Macedonian power, spent 3 years of his youth, from 368 to 365 BC, in Thebes as an honorable hostage, living in the house of Pamenes, Epaminondas' comrade in arms. The status of honorary hostage meant that his life was a guarantee of peaceful relations, but at the same time gave him the opportunity to observe the structure of a foreign polis from within. Epaminondas' student was Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, who adopted his tactical innovations for the Macedonian army. He saw how the city discussed not only the number of soldiers, but also the formation of the army, and how seriously they took military training. He observed the training of the sacred band, the maneuvers of the phalanx, and the interaction of the cavalry, and realized that traditional hoplite warfare was obsolete if the enemy was capable of thinking in new ways. Philip did not simply copy his teacher's ideas, he developed them further. Where Epaminondas had deepened the phalanx situationally for a breakthrough, Philip made depth the standard and armed his soldiers with sarissas, 6-meter pikes. The Macedonian king turned the idea of a decisive cavalry strike, which Epaminondas had used at Mantinea, into a military doctrine. The phalanx became the anvil holding back the enemy, and the heavy cavalry became the hammer, delivering the deadly blow. Alexander the Great effectively fought according to Epaminondas' textbooks. He inherited from his father and his teachers not only an army, but also a way of thinking, where maneuver was more important than sheer numbers. The Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander, despite the numerical superiority of the Persians, struck at the center, shifting the emphasis to the flanks, was an echo of Leuctra and Mantinea. The principle of a concentrated strike on a decisive point and the use of mobile units to break through enemy formations all go back to the decisions first tried out by Epaminondas. It can be argued that without Epaminondas, there would have been no Hellenistic era. He cracked the code of war and passed it on to those who used it to conquer Asia. Thus, ideas from the Boeotian lakes reached the Indus, expanding the boundaries of the world that the Greeks considered their own. Epaminondas died, but his genius continued to march in the sandals of the Macedonian phalangists, in their every step and turn of formation. The fate of Sparta after Epaminondas' blows became a lesson. The city that had dictated the will of Hellas became a shadow, an echo of its former power. Deprived of the Messenian lands and the Helots, the power shrank to its valley, like a drying river retreating into a narrow channel. The attempts of reformers, Agis IV and Cleomenes III, to revive the city's greatness were shattered by the reality created by Epaminondas. Without slave labor, the Spartan system became impossible. It was possible to change the laws and call for the old valor, but it was impossible to restore the economic base on which it all depended. By the time of Roman rule, Sparta had become a museum city, where Romans came to watch rituals and the flogging of young men at the altar of Artemis. For them, it was a spectacle, part of their travels, an opportunity to see ancient customs without feeling threatened by them. The great warrior became a spectacle, a living decoration, like an old gladiator showing his scars for coins. This was Epaminondas' final victory. He destroyed not Sparta, but the meaning of its existence. It ceased to be a power and remained only a monument to itself. The most painful humiliation for Sparta was not only the loss of land, citizens, and alliances, but also the fact that Epaminondas had wrested from it its monopoly on the very concept of valor. While Lacedaemon dictated to Hellas what constituted courage, bravery, and the right way of life, the other city-states either tried to emulate its severity or justified their own weakness by saying that we can never be like the Spartans. After Leuctra, the campaigns in the Peloponnese, and the founding of Messene and Mantinea, this scale of values was thrown off balance. It turned out that cold-blooded calculation, the ability to form alliances, the ability to think outside the box and recognize change, were more important than fanatical adherence to ancient rules. Parents in different cities could now say to their sons, "Not everyone who shouts about bravery is worthy of emulation. Look to those who can count the steps of an army and foresee the consequences of peace." For the Spartans, accustomed to considering themselves the living embodiment of the ideal warrior, the very idea that now not only Leonidas, but also Epaminondas would be remembered at symposiums was unbearable. In their conversations, warriors and strategists increasingly referred to the Theban, discussing his formations, his diplomatic moves, his decisions in Messenia and the Peloponnese, and thus unwittingly relegating the Spartan school to the past. Thus, step by step, Lacedaemon was transformed from a source of norms into an example of error. What had previously been cited as a model became a warning. This was Epaminondas' greatest triumph. He did not simply defeat an army and bleed a state dry. He changed the internal compass of Hellas, depriving Sparta of its right to be the measure of courage. And the victor himself? After Mantinea, when Epaminondas' body was being prepared for burial, it became clear that the man who had ruled the most powerful polis in Greece had no possessions. Only an old cloak and a single iron coin. He died in poverty, leaving behind neither gold, nor palaces, nor land. In a world where success is often measured by accumulated wealth, this seemed paradoxical. But for him, it was the natural outcome of a life lived for the cause, not for the sake of treasure chests. His friends said, "You are dying childless, Epaminondas. Your line will be broken." In their eyes, it was almost a tragedy, for human memory clings to names through descendants. He replied, "No, I leave you two immortal daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea. They will preserve my name for centuries." For him, a battlefield with the right plan was a better monument than any marble. He was right. Odysseus was famous for his cunning, Achilles for his thirst for glory. Epaminondas chose service, not for the sake of songs, but to change the world. One man, armed with reason and selflessness, turned history upside down. He did not build a dynasty, but he created the future of military art. He left no gold, but he left an example of how the invincible myth crumbles to dust when force is applied at the right point. His path shows that true power lies not in holding a sword over the heads of others, but in changing the rules by which the sword is raised and lowered. In the pantheon of great men of antiquity, Epaminondas stands apart as a citizen who forced history to change course. He proved that true power is not muscle or numbers, but intellect.
And this lesson, taught on the fields of Boeotia, changed the world forever, showing that even in the chaos of spears and shields, the movement of thought is paramount. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you again in the world of myths and their hidden truths.